You think the Victorian era was all corsets, carriages, and candlelit romance? Think again. Beneath the polished boots and silk waistcoats lay something far more terrifying disease. Not the kind you recover from with rest and chicken soup, but the kind that rotted your flesh, choked your children in their sleep, and swept through entire cities like a biblical curse. This was the real Victorian nightmare, where every cough might be your last, and a simple fever could turn into a death sentence. The era we often romanticize as elegant and enlightened was in truth a battlefield for the human body. Medicine was primitive doctors guessed more than they cured, and sanitation barely a concept. Open sewers snaked through city streets. Chamber pots were dumped from windows onto crowds below. And within that filth, invisible killers thrived. They didn't care if you were a chimney sweep or a duchess. When they came for everyone. Behind the velvet drapes of mansions and in the suffocating slums of industrial London, the same sounds echoed: children gasping for breath, bodies writhing in fever, and the silence that followed a final cough. These weren't just illnesses. They were monsters in disguise, devouring families, shaping empires, and forcing entire societies to their knees. And yet many of them still exist today, muted by vaccines, yes, but never truly gone. So before you light a candle to the charm of the 19th century, let's pull back the curtain on its darkest truth. In this video, we'll count down the 10 most horrifying diseases of the Victorian era, each more brutal, more disgusting, and more inescapable than the last. Think you're ready? You're not. Because once you see what lurked in the lungs, guts, and blood of our ancestors, you'll never look at history the same way again. It started with a cough, maybe a little runny nose. Nothing serious, just the sniffles, a low-grade fever, maybe a bit of fatigue. But in Victorian London, this wasn't a harmless cold. It was the beginning of a slow, suffocating descent into something far more sinister: measles. Today we treat it like a minor inconvenience, a childhood rite of passage easily prevented by a routine vaccine. But back then it was a smiling assassin, charming in its familiarity, lethal in its silence. In the cramped, soot-stained rooms where entire families shared a single mattress and fresh air was a fantasy, measles spread like wildfire. One infected child could set off a chain reaction of misery that wiped out entire households. The symptoms escalated with terrifying speed. A full-body rash that turned the skin an angry shade of crimson. Eyes so inflamed they sealed shut. Coughs that rattled lungs raw. But it wasn't the rash that killed, it was what came next. Pneumonia, brain swelling, deafness, blindness. Measles didn't just strike, it lingered, infecting the body, then crippling the future. And worst of all, it targeted the weak, the malnourished, the already sick, the very young. In the workhouses and tenement slums of the 1800s, children were easy prey. Victorian parents knew the signs and feared them like the devil. A fevered child meant nights of sleepless dread, hoping for survival, but bracing for death. No antibiotics, no hospitals with clean linens and oxygen, just hope, prayer, and the bitter reality that even love couldn't save them. Measles was the disease that wore a familiar face, then tore your world apart. In a society obsessed with appearances, measles was the ultimate betrayal, spreading quietly beneath the surface until it exploded into full-blown horror. It was never just a childhood illness. It was a test of who would live and who would be forgotten. And in the Victorian world, it failed far too many. It didn't come with screams. It came with color. A strange, angry red that crept across the skin like wildfire, hot, rashy, and impossible to ignore. That's how Scarlet Fever announced its arrival in the Victorian era. Not with dramatic collapse, but with a blush, a sandpaper-like rash, a tongue that turned a vivid, almost surreal shade of red. So red, in fact, it earned the name Strawberry Tongue. But don't let the poetic nickname fool you. Scarlet Fever was anything but pretty. It was vicious, fast-moving, and in the 1800s, utterly untreatable. The first signs were deceptively ordinary sore throat, swollen glands, a mild fever. But within hours, the body ignited. Children burned with fever so intense their skin peeled in sheets. Their throats became raw tunnels of pain. And even if they survived the initial onslaught, the disease had one more trick up its crimson sleeve: rheumatic fever. A secondary condition that scarred the heart, damaged the kidneys, and often came back like a curse years later. Scarlet fever didn't just kill, it haunted. In the dark hallways of Victorian homes, whispers spread faster than the illness itself. Have you seen her rash? Did you hear about the boy next door? Mothers kept vigil by candlelight, praying the redness would fade, not deepen. Without antibiotics, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait and watch the disease either burn itself out or burn a child from the inside. What made scarlet fever so terrifying wasn't just its cruelty, it was its silence, its suddenness. The fact that it preyed on the young, the innocent, the bright-eyed school children who were here one day and buried the next. In a world obsessed with control, scarlet fever reminded everyone that death didn't need a scythe. Sometimes it only needed a rash. They called it consumption, not because it consumed your time or your energy, but because it consumed your body. Slowly, silently, completely. In the Victorian imagination, tuberculosis was oddly romanticized. Pale skin, sunken cheeks, delicate coughs, all signs of a soul too fragile for this world. Poets and painters immortalized its victims as tragic muses glowing with a ghostly beauty. But behind the candlelight and canvas was a disease so relentless, so horrifying, it didn't just take lives, it devoured them. It started with a cough, a dry, persistent whisper that refused to leave. Then came the fever, the weight loss, the night sweats that drenched the sheets like a flood of fear. Blood followed, coughing fits that rattled through bones and sprayed red into handkerchiefs. In the final stages, it looked like the victim was fading. Before your eyes, that hollowed ribs that protruded, voices reduced to raspy gasps. They weren't dying quickly. They were disappearing day by day. In a world packed with unventilated tenements and industrial soot, tuberculosis thrived. One breath, one cough, that's all it took. It moved through slums, factories, and parlors alike. No one was spared. Aristocrats died as easily as beggars. Families buried one child after another, and with no cure, no antibiotics, and no real understanding of bacteria, the only prescriptions were fresh air, bed rest, and hope. But perhaps the cruelest twist was how it blurred the line between beauty and death. The very symptoms that signaled the end, pale skin, thin limbs, poetic melancholy, were seen as signs of refinement. In a world obsessed with image, tuberculosis was the disease that made you look beautiful while it killed you. And by the time society realized the cost of that illusion, thousands had already wasted away their final breaths, barely louder than a whisper. It wasn't the silence that terrified Victorian parents, it was the sound. A sound so distinct, so haunting, it became a death knell in the night, the whoop. Not a scream, not a cry, but a gasping, high-pitched inhale that followed violent coughing fits, as if the child was desperately clawing for one last breath. This was whooping cough, or pertussis, a disease that didn't just torment its victims, but tormented anyone forced to listen. It began innocently like a common cold, a sniffle, maybe a sore throat, nothing that raised alarms. But within days, that minor irritation turned into a brutal siege. Children would cough until their lips turned blue, until they vomited, until they passed out in their mother's arms. In some cases, the coughing was so severe, it caused brain damage from lack of oxygen. For infants, it was often a death sentence, and a slow one. The cruel irony. These children were completely aware during their episodes, conscious as their lungs betrayed them. In the crowded, polluted quarters of Victorian cities, whooping cough was nearly impossible to contain. It spread like wildfire through households, schools, and orphanages, leaving behind a trail of exhausted, grieving families. There were no ventilators, no antibiotics, just wet cloths on foreheads, trembling hands on tiny chests, and long, sleepless nights filled with the rhythmic horror of that whoop echoing through the walls. Unlike some diseases that struck suddenly, pertussis dragged its victims through weeks of agony. It wasn't just the disease that killed, it was the relentlessness, and worst of all, it often came for the smallest, sweetest voices first. In the Victorian era, when a child began to whoop, parents didn't ask if they'd survive. They asked how many nights they had left. Some Victorian diseases announced themselves with fire and fury, rashes, coughing fits, fevers that burned through families. But syphilis, It whispered. It crept. It hid behind masks of decency and denial, destroying lives not with spectacle but with shame. This wasn't just a disease. It was a scandal, a sexually transmitted secret passed behind velvet curtains and gaslit bedrooms wearing the disguise of silence. And by the time its victims admitted something was wrong, it was already too late. Syphilis began with a small, painless sore so insignificant it was often ignored. Then came the rashes, the hair loss, the strange aches that mimicked other illnesses. For a while it might even vanish, tricking its host into thinking they'd healed. But syphilis never healed. It waited. And when it returned, it came with a vengeance, eating into the brain, the heart, the nervous system. Victims lost their memories, their sanity, their ability to speak or walk. Some went mad. Others died screaming, their bodies and minds rotting from the inside out. What made syphilis so devastating wasn't just its symptoms, it was the silence surrounding it. In a society obsessed with purity and propriety, few dared to seek treatment. After all, acknowledging the disease meant confessing how you got it. For women, it could mean ruin. For men in power, politicians, poets, aristocrats, it meant cover-ups, bribery, and lies. Treatment was available, yes, but it involved mercury. And mercury didn't just poison the disease, it poisoned you too. This was the Victorian era's most ironic killer, a disease fueled by desire, punished by silence, and treated with poison. In every ballroom, every brothel, every bedroom it lurked. Syphilis was the rot beneath the romance, the beautiful decay behind the mask of civilization, and the reminder that in a world ruled by appearances, the deadliest things were always the ones no one dared to name. You didn't have to inhale it. You didn't have to touch the sick. All it took was a sip of water, a bite of soup, a single careless swallow. That's how typhoid fever entered the body quietly and visibly and turned ordinary meals into death sentences. In the filth-choked cities of the Victorian era, where sewage ran through open gutters and clean water was a fantasy, typhoid didn't need an invitation. It was already everywhere. The symptoms struck hard and fast. High fevers that felt like fire under the skin. Blinding headaches, stomach cramps so severe victims doubled over in agony. Some developed a faint spotted rash, others bled internally without warning. As the infection took hold, the body became weak, limp, and delirious. Patients stopped eating, then stopped talking. Some never got back up. But what made typhoid especially cruel was how quickly it moved, wiping out entire families within days, jumping from cup to cup, mouth to mouth, house to house. Even royalty wasn't immune. Queen Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert, is widely believed to have died from typhoid, a grim reminder that no amount of wealth could protect you from what you couldn't see. And while the upper class could flee to the countryside, the poor had no such escape. Their water came from the same rivers they dumped their waste into. For them, infection wasn't a possibility. It was an eventuality. Doctors were helpless. There were no antibiotics, no IV fluids, no understanding of bacteria, just leech's prayer and the gut-wrenching task of burying child after child. Typhoid fever wasn't dramatic or loud, it didn't need to be. It simply turned life's most basic need, water, into a weapon. In the Victorian world, survival didn't just depend on luck, it depended on every single thing you ate, drank, or touched. And typhoid was always waiting. It didn't scream. It didn't rush in. It crept slowly, quietly until your own body became your prison. Diphtheria wasn't like the plagues that painted skin with blisters or racked bodies with fever. No, this killer had a crueler signature. It stole your breath. And in the Victorian world, where medical understanding barely scratched the surface, diphtheria was the unseen monster that lurked in the throats of the innocent, especially children. It began like any common cold. A little sore throat, mild fatigue, maybe a touch of fever. But then came the thick gray membrane, a toxic film forming over the tonsils, creeping downward like a slow, suffocating blanket. Victims struggled to swallow, then struggled to speak. Their voices weakened. Then came the gasping, the wheezing, the blue lips. And finally, silence. Not because the disease had passed, but because the airway was sealed shut. Diphtheria didn't just sicken, it strangled. In the candlelit bedrooms of Victorian homes, parents could do nothing but watch. A child who had been laughing at breakfast might be dead by nightfall. There were no emergency tracheotomies, no oxygen tanks, no antitoxins until the very end of the century. Doctors tried to cut open throats or scrape away the film primitive procedures, often more horrifying than the disease itself. And for those who survived, the trauma wasn't over. Diphtheria could damage the heart nerves and kidneys, leaving children paralyzed or weakened for life. But perhaps the most terrifying part, it spread with ease on toys on hands and kisses goodnight. One sick child could doom an entire household. In the Victorian imagination, diphtheria became the boogeyman in the nursery, a ghost that appeared with a cough and left behind only silence. It didn't just kill. It made you listen to your child suffocate, slowly and helplessly. You didn't survive smallpox, you escaped it, and even if you lived it, never let you forget. Long after the fever broke, long after the sores had scabbed over smallpox left its victims branded, scarred, disfigured, and haunted. In the Victorian era, this disease was the stuff of nightmares, unstoppable, untreatable, and utterly unforgiving. It didn't just take lives, it took faces, beauty, identity. It struck fast. High fever chills and vomiting hit like a hammer. Then came the rash, first on the tongue and mouth, then exploding across the skin in painful, pus-filled blisters that covered every inch of the body. Eyes, genitals, even inside the throat. The pain was excruciating. Victims burned from within as their bodies erupted on the outside. And when those blisters finally ruptured, they left behind pockmarks so deep they carved memories into the skin. For many survivors, a mirror became a cruel reminder of what the disease had stolen. Smallpox didn't discriminate. It swept through royal palaces and workhouses alike. In cities like London, outbreaks turned entire neighborhoods into morgues. Streets emptied, shops closed, families barricaded themselves indoors, praying they wouldn't hear the telltale screams from next door. And yet, despite its terror, smallpox also ignited one of humanity's greatest medical revolutions. Edward Jenner's discovery that exposure to cowpox could protect against it laid the foundation for modern vaccination. But in the Victorian age, vaccines were controversial, scarce, and sometimes distrusted. Many went unprotected, and the disease kept coming wave after wave. Mothers watched helplessly as one child survived disfigured, while another was buried before their 6th birthday. Smallpox wasn't just a disease, it was a lifelong sentence, a thief of faces and futures. In a society obsessed with outward appearance, it was the cruelest punishment, imaginable survival at the cost of being seen. You could go to bed feeling perfectly fine and be dead by sunrise. That was the terrifying speed of cholera, the Victorian era's most ruthless killer. No disease moved faster. No disease exposed the fragility of life more cruelly. It didn't linger. It didn't warn. It struck like lightning, collapsing the strongest bodies into lifeless husks within hours. Cholera lived in the water, but not just any water, the kind millions drank every day. In Victorian cities where sewage flowed through open gutters and drinking water came from rivers polluted with human waste, every sip was a gamble. Once infected, symptoms came fast and merciless. Sudden stomach cramps, violent vomiting, explosive diarrhea. The dehydration was so extreme that skin turned blue, eyes sank into their sockets, and lips cracked like old leather. In the final hours, the body looked like it had been drained of life because it had. Entire households collapsed in a single night. Children died in their mother's arms before help could arrive. And worse, no one understood why. The idea that water could carry disease was still controversial. Some blamed foul air, others divine punishment. Meanwhile, the real killer flowed from tap to table, invisible and unchecked. But cholera did more than kill, it exposed. It exposed the rot beneath Victorian progress, the horrifying truth that beneath the wealth and empire people were dying by the thousands for lack of clean water. The tragedy forced change. The sheer scale of death pushed cities like London to build modern sewage systems and rethink public health entirely. In the end, cholera didn't just devastate the Victorian world, it transformed it. But before it inspired reform, It inspired terror, because in that world, death didn't knock, it poured from your faucet. And once it reached your lips, there was no going back. It didn't boil your skin like smallpox. It didn't choke you like diphtheria. It didn't even leave a mark, and that's what made it so terrifying. Influenza, what we casually call the flu today, was the most unseen, underestimated, and unstoppable killer of the Victorian era. It came without warning, spread without mercy, and killed without discrimination. No scars, no screams, just silence and then collapse. In a time with no antivirals, no vaccines, and no understanding of how viruses worked, influenza struck like a ghost. One person sneezed in a crowded parlor. The next day, a dozen more were in bed. By the end of the week, half the street was too weak to move. Fevers soared, muscles ached as if crushed under weight, and chills rattled through bones like death tapping on the spine. For the elderly, the very young, or the already ill, it was often a swift descent from coffin to coffin. But the flu didn't always kill on its own. It opened the door. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and other infections flooded in behind it like wolves through a broken gate. And because it looked so ordinary, just a bad cold, just a few days in bed, people underestimated it until it was far too late. That was its weapon, familiarity. It didn't need to shock to destroy. It only had to spread. Victorian society, already burdened by poor nutrition and overcrowding, crumbled under its weight. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, public events vanished. And in the homes of both factory workers and noblemen, the same question whispered, will they still be breathing tomorrow? Influenza was the perfect predator, invisible, adaptable, and relentless. In a world obsessed with controlling nature, it was a humbling force. And in the age of empire and industry, it reminded humanity that sometimes the most terrifying killer is the one you never see coming. They weren't just illnesses. They were architects of history. These 10 diseases, measles, scarlet fever, tuberculosis, whooping cough, syphilis, typhoid, diphtheria, smallpox, cholera, and influenza, weren't silent background details in Victorian life. They were front and center, shaping policy, restructuring cities, rewriting family trees, and reprogramming the very way people understood life, death, and the fragility in between. Each cough, each blister, each final breath became a thread in a larger tapestry, a brutal reminder that progress isn't just built in factories or fought on battlefields. Sometimes it's carved into the skin of the dying. The suffering of one generation became the medical breakthroughs of the next. The heartbreak of Victorian parents watching their child suffocate from diphtheria eventually gave rise to vaccines that now save millions. The mass deaths from cholera forced governments to finally value sanitation. Even the disfigurement of smallpox survivors fueled the discovery of immunization, changing human destiny forever. But the lesson doesn't stop in the 1800s. These diseases are not just relics. Some of them still exist, waiting in the shadows, held back only by science awareness and collective responsibility. In a post-pandemic world, Americans know all too well that illness is not just a personal event. It's a societal one. The choices we make, whether to vaccinate, to fund public health, to listen to science, are no longer abstract. They are moral decisions with ripple effects we can't always see. If the Victorian era teaches us anything, it's this: the real enemy is never just the disease. It's ignorance. It's inaction. It's the lie we tell ourselves that we're safe just because we're comfortable. Progress is fragile. Health is earned. And history, if we ignore it, has a nasty habit of repeating itself. So as you turn off this video, remember, every breath you take without fear, every child you tuck in without worry, is a luxury your ancestors never had. Don't waste it. Protect it. And never forget the price that was paid to give it to you. If this journey through history shook you, made you think twice about the world we live in today, don't let it end here. Drop a comment below. Which disease shocked you the most? Save this video so you never forget how far we've come. And if you want more stories that pull back the curtain on the past's darkest truths, hit that subscribe button. Every like, comment, and follow helps us keep these forgotten voices alive and reminds the world that history isn't just something we learn, it's something we carry.